This video is for the first chapter of The Family, Diversity, Inequality, and Social Change, your textbook written by Philip Cohen. Chapter 1 is entitled A Sociology of the Family. So this chapter begins with a discussion of the kind of increased interest in America around genealogy, which is the study of ancestry and family history. And one way to kind of think about, this renewed interest is how technology has made, genetic testing much simpler and convenient than in the past. If you've ever taken a 23andMe or Ancestry, at-home kit, all you do is you have the swab and you send it in and they send you back all of this information. With Ancestry.com in particular, then encouraging you to go online and make use of their digitized historical records to do more explorations of your family tree. And so, Cohen opens up this chapter by kind of discussing, why do we have this interest in genealogy? Why is it so important to us to know, who our family is? Where do we come from? And they talk about the fact that these connections aren't just genetic. So obviously you can get important genetic information by studying your family tree, whether or not you have a likelihood to develop a certain disease or condition. But you also, of course, have this symbolic link to the past as well. And these symbolic connections are perhaps even more important to a lot of people than any real kind of genetic or health-related concerns. So the first of your required, external reading sources for this chapter is from the Everyday Sociology blog. And that is a blog that I like to use in this class. So, you probably are going to see it again. But it is by an author, Sternheimer, and it's entitled Families and Ancestry. And it's very short, but I want to make sure that you read this and you be able to take from it, what does she say about how this interest in genealogy, how it's, impacting how we define families. Is a family member just someone that you are related to by blood, even if you've never heard of them before, even if you grew up in different homes. And then conversely, what about the people that you consider to be family who are not related to you by blood or by affinity, meaning, this isn't someone you're related to, this isn't someone that you marry, but this is someone who, operates in your life as if they were family. And there are a lot of different terms in sociology that refer to those types of people. So, in a lot of ways, this article is about how the definition of family in contemporary American society has been changed. It's been changed by, these technological advances that allow people to trace their ancestry, as well as the technological advances that, allow people to bring life into this world. There have been so many technological advances related to fertility in the last 10, 20 years. There have been changes in policy. She mentions, and we'll talk about, Obergefell v. Hodges multiple times in this class, but, the importance of allowing people who are in same-sex relationships to be able to legally marry. That is still a relatively new change in our society, or still a relatively new policy. So of course that impacts how we define and how we define family. And then of course, just the cultural perspective. And she kind of touches on this, when she talks about how, TV shows and other forms of media have kind of shaped, this expanded notion of who do we consider to be family. And that's really what this first part of your chapter, because this chapter can really be thought of as being divided into three parts. This first part really is focused on definitions. How do we define family? And so a lot of this is straight from your book, and I'm certainly not going to read and go over it. I'm just going to kind of hit the highlights. Of course, you need to be reading and taking notes as you read, as you listen to this video. So just because you don't hear me verbally say it does not mean it's not necessarily important. But, one of the most kind of significant points that come out of this first section is just the fact that there is no single definition of family. So, Cohen offers a working definition that a family is a group of related people bound by connections that are biological, legal, or emotional. And he notes that not everyone agrees with that above definition. And I will tell you that the aspect that they are least likely to agree with is that emotional aspect. Because, historically, in our culture, we have defined families kind of based on these biological and legal connections, but really, it's only been in the last few decades that we've started to think about the fact that, people can serve the role as family in your life, even if there is no biological tie, even if there's no legal tie. And so, the chapter talks about, there are a range of social obligations that exist between family members. Some of them are formal, meaning that they have been encoded by law. There are, parents are legally required to care for their children, to actually provide for their basic, necessities, shelter and food. There are, and then of course they're informal, right? Just the kind of informal expectation that, we think of, like that parents are supposed to care for their children, like emotionally care and support them. And what does that look like? They talk about it in regards to commitment. Of course, there are formal aspects of commitment, of the commitment that you make, to your spouse, your partner. And then there's this informal aspect, this expectation people have of fidelity and monogamy that it exists beyond, the legal requirements and so forth. So one way that Cohen kind of begins this definition, this process of defining families, providing definitions for families, is distinguishing between personal families and legal families. So personal families are the people we feel related to and who we expect to define us as members of their family as well. So these are people, sometimes they are captured by blood and legal ties, but not necessarily. And so your book specifically, talks about the fact that this allows for the inclusion of stepchildren, step parents, informal and formal adoptions, especially as we've become a country of what I like to call serial monogamous, right? So, people in this country, most marry, and a growing number marry, divorce, remarry, and then a smaller percentage among those, marry, divorce, remarry, divorce, remarry, divorce. And what you have to think is every time they remarry, their family becomes blended. And then when they split, the question, remains, are those people still family, right? So, what happens when your step parent, your step grandparents, if your parent divorces your step parent, are those step grandparents in your life? Well, legally, there is no connection or tie, but depending on the person, depending on the family, that personal tie can still be there. So personal family is that more inclusive definition. Legal family is a much more narrow definition. This is a group of individuals who are related by birth, marriage, or adoption. And this is like state-imposed legal definition. So, you are legally married, you've legally adopted someone. And because it brings in the government, all of this, whether you're giving birth, whether you're getting married, whether you're adopting someone, there is this legal side of it. There is this bureaucratic side of it where you file a birth certificate, you apply for a marriage license, you go through the process of legally adopting someone. So, you know, you're now bringing in this kind of third party who gets to kind of impose their definition of you know, what counts. So in your Cohen notes that, you know, of the three, birth, marriage, or adoption, where there has been the most controversy, where the meaning has been most contested, has obviously been around marriage. And, you know, what probably comes to your mind now, of course, is same-sex marriage. And kind of up until Obergefell v. Hodges, you know, the fact that different states were addressing same-sex marriage differently, whether or not they were allowing it or prohibiting it, whether or not they were allowing domestic partnerships or whether they were actually allowing marriage. You know, there was just a lot of controversy around the subject. But it's worth noting that, you know, if you go back even further in history, 50 or 60 years, this was the issue around interracial marriage. So marriage has been the most contested of the definitions when it comes to legal family. So one government entity we can look to, you know, in terms of how do they specifically define family, is the Census Bureau. So, you know, obviously the census is the official counting of the population, the official like gathering of population data, and it happens every 10 years. And your book talks about the fact that the definition that the census has used to define family, who counts as family, this has changed over time. The kind of current definition, a group of two people or more, one of whom is the householder, related by birth, marriage, or adoption, and residing together. That's the definition that they currently use. And if you're interested in, like, you know, how do they actually try to measure and gather this data, you know, figure 1.1, it showed you what that question looked like on the 2020 census. So you can kind of go through and see all the ways in which, you know, all the categories that were provided that people were able to identify to describe their relationship with the other people in their household. So, you know, of course, who gets left out of that definition? Well, people who, you know, don't meet that legal definition of family. If they are not married or related, you know, biologically, by blood, or by legal adoption, you can kind of see, for the most part, that they are left out. So, you know, your fictive kin, you know, your roommate who's like a sister, your one thing that is unique is, you know, we now have some very specific categories about unmarried partners. And that's something we didn't have in the past. In past censuses, that was a person that was usually left out. You know, what about if you're two friends who, you know, decide to live together and raise your children so that you have two parents in the household? You know, there are these people that potentially, you know, you might think of as being family that are left out of this legal definition, that are left out of this Census Bureau definition. And so this is always the challenge of the census, is trying to collect, you know, be inclusive in the definition. So you collect data that really is accurately capturing how people think and talk about their families. It's worth noting that a family is not the same as a household. And if you read that part that focuses specifically on the census, you'll know that they discuss, you know, what makes that a distinct definition. All the people who occupy a housing unit, sometimes it's referred to as all the people who share a dining table. And so the idea, of course, is that household is more inclusive than family, because you maybe are sharing a dining table with people who do not meet that definition of being family, right? So this might be, you know, the roommate, you know, or a boarder, you know, a friend, So it is the more inclusive definition of everyone living in the home, and family, of course. One issue with the family definition in the Census Bureau is it doesn't capture who you consider to be family who is no longer living in the home. And so certainly, of course, when you start talking about like college students who are away at college, that also kind of complicates our definition. So, one thing to kind of consider is, whether or not these different examples, whether or not they would be considered a family by the census, versus, this kind of broad textbook definition. So I challenge you to kind of go through and see if you can assess for these different scenarios, which definition is or is not applicable, the census definition, the textbook definition. So Cohen introduces this idea of the institutional arena, and the definition, a social space in which relations between people in common positions are governed by accepted rules of interaction. In a lot of ways, institutional arenas are kind of similar in concept to social institutions. So if you've heard that concept before in your introductory sociology class, it might be useful to kind of just link those concepts together. But it's this idea that within an arena, there are specific roles that people can occupy. And between those roles, there are formal and informal rules of interaction. And these rules, of course, are culturally specific, so they can vary from place to place. They vary, over time. So before we talk about the three that the textbook focuses on, if you're thinking about the school as an institutional arena, right, you have all of the different roles that, adults occupy. You have teachers and you have staff and you have administrators, you have groundskeepers, you have cafeteria workers, right? And then there are, of course, rules related to how they interact with one another. And then there are rules related to how they interact with the children, the students. And then even among the students, there might be specific positions. If, is there, a class leader, student body president, and so all of this is this idea that, you can understand an institution better by considering its institutional arena, by considering, the different roles that exist with that arena and the type of interactions that are taking place. Now, your book notes that when discussing the family, there are three arenas that Cohen identifies as being significant: the family, the state, and the market. So he talks about each individually. The family arena, this is largely the private arena where people practice intimacy, childbearing, and socialization. Obviously the roles within families are like parents and children, siblings. And they note that a lot of the rules are informal, although there are some formal ones, like, parents are formally required to provide for their children. You can't just like let your child fend for themselves. Like, you don't tell a 8-year-old child like, oh, well, I'm not cooking tonight, you're going to have to figure something out. Not only, if you said that, not only would that violate an informal expectation that you're supposed to care for your child, you also would be in danger of violating a formal law that protects against child neglect. The next institutional arena that Cohen addresses is the state. So with the state, you want to think about this as the government. And so this is the institutional arena where behavior is legally regulated, violence is controlled, and resources are redistributed. So basically, the state makes laws, When people violate those laws, the state has the ability to punish and dole out consequences. And then, of course, the state also provides specific resources, and this could be through the form of, cash assistance, other types of governmental programs. The state, of course, is responsible for collecting taxes and then providing public services with those tax dollars, everything from road maintenance to schools, to perhaps public health clinics or public libraries. And so your book notes that, as noted, they regulate our behaviors and redistribute these resources through laws and policies. And so, think about the laws and policies that impact family life. Some of them, of course, are things like marriage license, divorce petitions, adoption hearings. But then there are also policies kind of related to family relations, like, the presence of children in your home, if you're lower income, can result in eligibility for, specific government assistance programs. The number of dependents in your home, it influences, the amount of, for instance, like what we oftentimes call welfare, food stamps, being eligible for Section 8 vouchers. All of those types of programs are somewhat dependent upon not just you not having adequate money, but also usually dependent upon you having dependents, usually in the form of young children, in your home. Which is why, if you've ever looked at the types of programs that are available for like a single childless person who is below the poverty line, there's usually, in a lot of states, not very much available. And then finally, the market. In the same way that you can think of the state being the government, the market is work, the economy and work. So this is the institutional arena where labor for pay takes place. And so, and that's because if how does this impact the family? Well, families have to be self-sustaining. They have to be able to support themselves and their members. And although they might be, eligible for some state programs, usually those are not sufficient, and most people are oftentimes not eligible. Most people are taking care of their families through the market. And then certainly you also utilize the market to engage in consumerism and buy the things that are needed, as well as just luxuries for your family through the market. So all of these arenas interact. All of them interact. All of them have significant amounts of overlaps in between them in terms of policies. And so one way that we will think about and talk about the family from a sociological perspective is how the family has been shaped, how family, particularly gender roles, have been shaped by changes within the state and within the market. That's going to be a reoccurring theme in the semester. If you want to get a better sense of how they interact and how they overlap, there's like a little short animation that comes from the publisher that I provided a link to. It's located in the Canvas module, and I encourage you to take a look at that and check that out. One of the ways that your book discusses where you see an overlap between all three, which is why I have repeated it multiple times, like I said, has to do with government assistance programs, welfare programs. Those programs have a substantial impact on families, and they come out of the state, and they are also based on the market. And so I think, this quote from page 16: "Throughout this book, we will use the idea of institutional arenas as a way to understand how larger forces interact with individuals and families to shape family life, and how the family in terms contributes to larger social trends." That really encapsulates not just what the focus of the book is, but really kind of what does it mean to talk and discuss about the family from a sociological perspective. Because what you know about sociology is that considering the relationship between individual experience and larger social forces is a primary objective of sociology. So I'm going to move a little bit away from the textbook material to talk a little bit about sociology, and then we'll bring it back to the textbook to talk about theory and then methods. So sociology is the scientific study of society and human behavior. That's the short, quick and dirty, definition there. I think two elements of the discipline that make it stand out when compared to the humanities or to other sciences. First of all, compared to the humanities, is that use of the scientific method. In sociology, empiricism is very important, meaning we collect data in order to study phenomena, in order to make informed observations about the social world. And we'll talk more about the scientific method in part 3 of this chapter. The other kind of aspect of sociology that makes it distinct from the other sciences, even the other social sciences, is the use of what we call the sociological perspective. I recommend, if you need kind of a reminder about what the sociological perspective is, you check out that video from Crash Course Sociology. It really does kind of do a good job of hitting the primary themes of the discipline and what does it mean to utilize the sociological perspective. And this idea, and I'm going to talk more about the sociological perspective here in a second, but just a reminder, sociology coined by Auguste Comte, he was one of our initial founders. From the very beginning, it was always understood that you were going to be philosophizing about the world, about your place in the world. But then, of course, you would try to support those ideas. You would try to prove those theories through empiricism. So the sociological perspective, at the heart of it, is this, notion that there is this bidirectional relationship between individuals and society. Individuals have an impact on society, but society has an impact on individuals. So your life is composed of, the decisions that you made, and you do have some element of agency, but at the same time, your life has also been shaped by the specific opportunities and barriers presented to you by living in a specific place at a specific time, and the kind of social structure and social forces that exist within that given society. Another way of kind of discussing the sociological perspective comes from sociologist C. Wright Mills, who gave us the concept of the sociological imagination. And, you maybe remember this from your introductory sociology course, but, the sociological imagination really emphasizes that overlap, that relationship between larger social history and your personal biography. So it's the idea that your story has been shaped, has been influenced by the society that you live in, by what is going on in that society. What is its culture like? What is its structure like? And that your personal biography would not be possible. It would not be the same if you were in a different social location. And so that is, and so that idea that you don't have 100% agency, that there are social forces at play, that you do have to contend with a social structure that you don't have complete control over is really maybe one of sociology's key insights, that many of the personal experiences people have and troubles they face are rooted in the structure and operation of larger society. So I want you to keep that in mind when we're talking about things throughout this semester that feel very individualistic, that feel very personal, you know, as we're talking about people's intimate relationships, as we're talking about, you know, how people date and find people to marry, as we talk about how marriages fall apart and people get divorced, as we talk about how people raise their children and how they make decisions about childbearing. You know, on one hand, yes, those are personal decisions, those are personal choices, those are personal experiences, but they are occurring in that larger social context. So in order to kind of begin that discussion of the empirical side of the discipline, we're first going to discuss the theoretical side of the discipline, because theory plays a very large role in sociology. In sociology, theory and research work together. And so theory, of course, is kind of, you know, an idea about how the world works. And the goal of a theory is to both explain and predict. So you are trying to explain the phenomena that's occurring, but you're also suggesting that it is predictive, meaning that based on this theory, you can predict when similar phenomena occurs, or you can predict why similar phenomena occurs. Sociologists use theories to study social problems, to study social phenomena, because it's like putting on a pair of glasses. If you put on, you know, a certain pair of glasses, it allows you to see far away. If you put on a certain pair of glasses, it allows you to see close up. If you put on a certain pair of glasses, you know, it allows you to block out the sunlight. If you put on a pair of those, you know, 3D glasses when you're at a movie theater watching a 3D movie, it makes the movie seem like it's jumping off the screen. So, you know, the glasses have a specific purpose. They allow you to see specific things. And that's how theory works in sociology. When you decide to use a particular theory to study a phenomena, you're going in with a set of pre-assumed assumptions and ideas about the phenomena that allows you to focus on specific things and, you know, not go off on tangents, you know, by noticing other things, because, you know, social phenomena, you know, human beings, human society, we're not lab rats, you know, in a lab. There are multiple factors that influence human behavior. There are multiple factors that influence people's decision making. So theories, you know, by choosing to utilize a specific theory, you're choosing to focus on a very specific set of factors. You're choosing to focus on a very specific explanation of the phenomena that you are witnessing or studying. And so, you know, you might remember this from your introductory sociology class. When we teach intro to sociology, we usually present it as we have three primary theoretical frameworks. Two are macro-sociological, meaning they describe large society. That's functionalism and conflict theory. And then we have a micro-sociological theoretical framework, that's symbolic interactionism. It's focused, instead of on larger society, it's focused more on smaller units, individuals and their interactions with one another and their interpretations of symbolic interaction, symbolic communication. So the second part of this chapter, and I'm going to go through this part a little bit quickly because a lot of this is straight from the textbook. I'm not going to be adding anything additional here. But the second part of this chapter is just highlighting some of those specific theories, some of those specific glasses that people tend to put on when they are talking about discussing, studying the family. So the consensus perspective, and this is kind of, I'm going backwards. This is kind of how he is, how Cohen is offering kind of a larger definition of functionalism. It projects an image of society as having this kind of collective expression of shared norms and values. He identifies Talcott Parsons, who we will talk about later in this course, as being a good example of a sociologist who advanced this perspective. And so it's this idea that, harmony is the basis of society and order, and that change, it's going to happen, but under the consensus perspective, change is not necessarily desirable. Change is not necessarily viewed as being progressive or a good thing. And so if you're thinking about family life and all the ways in which maybe families have changed over time, women entering the workforce, same-sex couples marrying, people using IVF and other technology in order to have children. A person coming from the consensus perspective would not necessarily view those changes in a solely positive light. The dominant sociological consensus theory is structural functionalism. It's why we present it as one of the primary perspectives. And that school of thought is associated, with the work of Emile Durkheim. He is a man, he is French, so it's not Emily, and he is not a she. And so when discussing structural functionalism from a family lens, one of the key concepts is this idea of the breadwinner homemaker family, and the fact that not just that this was considered to be the dominant family structure, but the fact that this structure was seen as being necessary in order to provide balance in the family. From the consensus perspective, this dominant model was seen as being ideal. And for the most part, structural functionalists did not really critique the ways in which this model came with some inherent issues, and nor did they really stop to think that not everyone was able to live up to this dominant ideal. So it's presented as being hegemonic, meaning everyone was doing it. But in reality, there have always been families that have been unable to emulate the breadwinner homemaker family. And then what we've learned is even families that had this model, it wasn't like they were perfect and problem-free. So this brings me to the second article that I'm asking you to read for this chapter. It comes from The Independent, and it says, being the primary breadwinner is bad for men's happiness and health, study finds. So I want you to read that article. One thing that we know is that when we're talking about millennials and we're talking about Generation Z, comparative to baby boomers, there is less desire for this breadwinner, full-time homemaker model. What we see among these younger generations is a desire for what we call egalitarian marriages, where both people to some extent participate in labor outside of the home and labor inside of the home. And so with that shifting cultural context, what does it mean when you still have some families where a person is the primary breadwinner? Well, what this article seems to suggest is, although it used to be normative for men to be the primary breadwinner, now that it's no longer normative, men respond differently to their breadwinner status. Or who knows, perhaps this is always how men felt about the breadwinner status, but because of cultural normativity and pressure to conform, they just didn't necessarily feel comfortable expressing it, or they maybe just didn't even know that it was acceptable to say, this world does not bring me much happiness. So, I am asking you to read this article and to consider, how does this article, what does it say about gender roles? Why do you think men still face a pressure today to be a breadwinner? Is it stigmatizing when they are not? Why do female breadwinners, according to this article, not have this same pressure and stigma? What did you think about that? So, with these articles, this is always, just interesting things to think about. Bringing me to my next perspective, this is the conflict perspective. It is just the opposite of the consensus perspective. And instead of emphasizing order and harmony and stability, instead what is emphasized is that opposition and conflict define a given society, that there is a status quo, and the status quo is looking out for, the interest of whoever the dominant group is in society. But for people who are not part of that dominant group, oftentimes it is in their best interest to challenge the status quo, and to push back against that inequality. The view in the conflict perspective of change is very different than the consensus perspective, because change is seen in a much more positive light here, and is thought that conflict can create positive change. And so, once again, think about some of the changes that we've seen in family structure, in family life. If a person is looking at those changes from a conflict perspective, they're likely to have a much more positive evaluation of the resulting consequences of those changes, than someone who is coming from it from a consensus perspective. One specific conflict perspective that comes up a lot when we talk about family is feminist theory. Feminist theory is related to feminism, the social movement, but they are not identical. So feminist theory is distinct from feminism itself as a political movement. And so feminist theory is a theory that seeks to understand and reduce inequality, largely between men and women. In recent years, it's been expanded to consider people who are non-binary, who complicate this kind of binary view of gender. And your book talks about how does feminist theory impact our study of families in various ways. And so there are three important contributions. Gender inequality is central to family life, and I have a slide on socialization coming up. Family structure is socially constructed, so it isn't natural, it isn't inevitable. That's one thing that sociologists, anthropologists, that's a conclusion that they've pretty much have come to. There are other ways that we could structure families that are not necessarily built around male dominance. And so that opens up the possibility, like I said, from the conflict perspective, that these resulting changes will be positive. Obviously, people that are looking at this from a consensus perspective might be a little less optimistic about these changes. And then the final one, which is less important, it's good to keep in mind that gender theory perspectives are not all the same. Feminist theory, there are different strains, different variants of feminist theory. There isn't necessarily just one, but that's more of a discussion for my gender class, less of a discussion for my family class. So one way in which we see gender inequality built into family life, is around socialization, which is the process through which people learn society. They learn elements of the social structure, and they incorporate what they learn into their own kind of self-concepts and self-identities. And so the family arena is where gender roles are initially learned and formed, through, how we decorate our children's rooms, the toys we buy them, the clothes we put them in. Oftentimes people will say something like, well, my child just likes fill in the blank, ignoring the fact that long before your child was aware of gender and gender expectations and gender stereotypes, you were buying clothes, you were buying toys, you painted the nursery in a theme, you gave compliments that indicated that some behavior was more or less acceptable, that some activities were more or less acceptable, based on your child's gender. And then children are very savvy. So by the time they do start to weigh in more about what they do and don't like, 3, 4, 5, 6, they have already been socialized to a certain extent into this kind of gendered view of the world. Another kind of way in which children learn about gender is looking at how it's enacted in their own family. So if they see mom doing the bulk of the cooking and cleaning, then it can become very easy for a child to then assume that this is what women do, that this is women's work. If, they only see dad going out in the work, if they only see dad cutting the grass, if they only see dad killing the bugs, then, similarly, they take this information and they form ideas about the role of gender. And so, family is only one side of gender socialization and gender inequality, but it is a primary site. So your last article associated with this chapter, it kind of complicates the previous article about the mental health toll of breadwinning on men, because this is now about female breadwinners, and it's entitled "Even Breadwinning Wives Don't Get Equality at Home." So, yes, maybe being a breadwinner, maybe women are less stressed about it than men, but now let's consider the home life. What happens at home when the woman is the breadwinner? Who is doing that caretaking and homemaking that has traditionally been associated with women, because traditionally women have not worked outside of the home and they have not been the primary breadwinner. So I think this article is really interesting because it further kind of addresses, what role does gender roles play in family functioning, even in contemporary society. So make sure you read that and check that out, and really think about how do these two articles speak to one another, because they're both about the same phenomena with, the gendered aspect of breadwinning. I'm going to move quickly through the next few theories. Not saying you need to move quickly through the book, but just I don't have a lot of additional information or contextualization to offer for these. So some other theories that are not part of the primary conflict consensus perspectives would be like exchange theory. And this is the idea that individuals or groups enter into mutual relationships to maximize their own gains. And so this is, kind of applies a cost-benefit analysis to why men, women marry, and that, these marriages are oftentimes represent a very deliberate and rational approach. So if I have a job where I don't make a lot of money, I might look for, according to exchange theory, a partner who makes more money in order to get the type of lifestyle I want to lead. And therefore, because they are providing me that lifestyle, I might be more willing to do more things around the home or what have you, because in exchange theory, it is about the exchange. Both sides need to feel like they're getting something and not being used. Because if the rewards of the exchange are not satisfactory, then, they might be willing to leave the relationship. The cost of the relationship may not be worth the benefits. And so, this is a very interesting theory, because oftentimes students feel like it strips love out of the equation, but it's certainly worth to consider. We like to analyze marriages 100, 200 years ago through this lens, but I would strongly encourage you to think about to what extent today are our dating, intimate, personal relationships perhaps still somewhat predicated around this idea of exchange. Symbolic interactionism, I briefly already discussed, this micro sociological perspective where the focus is on interactions, the focus is on communications. And so people that use this theory, they're usually looking at, how do people make meaning out of their interactions and communications with their family members? How do parents express their love to children, and do their children interpret it as such? Those are the types of questions that you answer and you address when you're using this type of perspective. And then finally, and to be honest, out of all the theories, this is probably the theory that you can skim the most. I'm not a huge fan of modernity theory. It basically is kind of a historical approach to thinking about phenomena, because it basically talks about the modern era, which is 18th century enlightenment to the present, and it splits it into kind of two time periods, what your book calls first modernity and what your book calls second modernity. And it just talks about how there were these changes that happened as we entered into the modern era. And then there have been changes that have now happened, as we move from first modernity to second modernity. And it's worth noting, in modernity theory, there are people who now argue that we are in what's called post-modern era. Like I said, just kind of know that families became more diverse. Behavior has become less regulated, and therefore there's more individuality in how we form families and how we raise our children and how we seek out and interact with our intimate partners. Out of all the theories, this is the theory that you can probably take the less notes on and be fine. One concept that comes out of that discussion of modernity and how and the interaction between the state, the market, and the family arena, and how it has changed, is at one point, the breadwinner homemaker family model was supported by the fact that employers in the market were largely just expected to provide what's called family wage, the amount of money that's needed in order for an earner, usually a male, to be able to take care of his wife and children without them having to work. And post-World War II, this is how a lot of families became middle class and moved out into the suburbs, is, during that, the 50s, there was this increase of jobs that didn't necessarily even require a college degree. These were those skilled blue collar jobs, but they paid enough money. They paid the family wage. Now, one challenge that a lot of marriages face is that with the rise in the cost of living, a lot of employers no longer consider it necessary to pay a family wage. And so this means even for families that would consider themselves to be conservative, they face a real uphill battle in trying to have this traditional model of a male breadwinner and a female homemaker, if their male breadwinner does not make a family wage. The trade-off often becomes, their standard of living. The last two perspectives, demographic perspective and life course perspective. The demographic perspective, as your book notes, is focused on how family behavior contributes to larger population processes. And what we mean by larger population processes is birth, death, migration. Demography is really interested in how populations change in size. And so, certainly we can look at how the age at first marriage, the age at first child birth, these have changed over time. What's considered to be the ideal family size has changed over time. I was very close to adding a fourth article that dealt with just that, how the ideal family size has changed over time, and what impact this has had on larger society. So the demographic perspective is a very narrow perspective. It's when you are interested in a very kind of specific focus within the study of the family. Going the wrong way. And the final of the theoretical perspectives is the life course perspective. And this is the study of family trajectories as they progress through their lives. And so, we kind of talk about, maybe what impact your family has on you from childhood to adolescence to, middle age to late age. Or we talk about, or we place family events in a historical context, and we compare how do children today compare to children in the 1970s to children in the 1930s. Your book talks about one way that we can kind of discuss this is by using cohorts, a group of people who experience an event together at the same point in time. So when we get to the chapter where we talk about the divorce revolution, sometimes people talk about that cohort of children that were raised during the divorce revolution, that first wave of kids who came from families that were undergoing separation and divorce before, right when it was on the cusp of being socially acceptable and normative, like when it was just starting to become more common. How did that go on to impact their lives? And were their lives impacted differently than children who undergo a divorce or separation today, where it is more common, it is more normative, it has more cultural support? So the life course perspective is just a good perspective to use when you're wanting to compare how things have changed in an individual's lifetime, or when you're wanting to compare how specific points in a person's life has changed over a historical time period. And it brings me to my final part of this chapter, which is 1.3, studying families. And this is the part that's related to data collection, related to the scientific method. So as we said, sociology is a science, meaning we use the scientific method to gather data and to create and test theories. And the scientific method just refers to that whole process of gathering empirical data. And you can see the 8 steps there. The step that we're going to focus on is step 5, choosing a research method. In sociology, we teach multiple classes about this. This, handful of pages is not meant to entirely inform you about data collection. It's just kind of to make you aware of different data collection methods if you haven't taken that course yet. One distinction that we often make is between quantitative and qualitative research. Quantitative research is when you're gathering data that can be quantified, that can be turned into numbers, when you can run statistical analyses. Oftentimes, this type of research has larger sample sizes and makes use of large-scale surveys. Because it is quantifiable and we can just kind of run, our computer statistical software programming to analyze it, and it spits out statistics. So if you're reading numbers, if you're reading statistical analyses, that's almost always quantitative research. Qualitative research is using data that cannot be quantified. So, if you're reading interview snippets or narratives, then that's qualitative data. Although we do use computer software programs to engage in qualitative data analysis, it is a very different beast than quantitative research. And oftentimes, just because of time and cost limitations, these are smaller samples, focus groups, observations, qualitative interviews. And the trade-off is although you don't have as many people participating, so you aren't able to ask your questions to as many people, you're able to ask deeper questions. And so you get more in-depth knowledge about phenomena from the people that you are asking or the people you are observing. If you're thinking about research methods, the specific techniques for systematically gathering data. One way you can think about it is, there are kind of 6 major types: survey, fieldwork, case studies, experimentation, secondary analysis, and unobtrusive measures. We're going to talk a good bit about survey, a little bit about fieldwork. I have a lot less to say about case studies, experimentation, and secondary analysis. And then we'll talk a little bit about unobtrusive measures, because this is kind of one form of unobtrusive measures that your book chapter ends with, is by talking about what they call big data. So survey research uses a survey tool with a group of people, and usually is self-reported data, meaning we're not observing them, we're taking their word for it. So we're asking them questions to determine their opinions and their behaviors. It can be in the form of a questionnaire, or it can be in the form of an interview. The difference is with a questionnaire, this instrument, people read the questions for themselves. They have access to the instrument itself. With the interview, you are reading the questionnaire to them. There is a second party there. And so, this can change the dynamic of the data collection a little bit. Most of the time, this is one-on-one, whether it's, via telephone, or the interview is whether it's via telephone or in person. If it's a questionnaire, it can be, in person or via email. If it is, if it involves more than one respondent, then we refer to this survey type as being a focus group. And once again, some types of topics are better suited for focus groups than others. Part of what determines whether or not something is ultimately considered to be a qualitative interview versus a quantitative interview is the type of questions being used. Because close-ended questions, where we give people responses, this is the type of question that can be turned into quantitative data. So sometimes students get confused and they think quantitative data are just questions that have numbers as answers, and that's not it. It's the idea that we can change those responses into numbers by using our statistical software. Open-ended questions, where you are asking someone a question and you're not giving them a forced choice response, this cannot be quantifiable. And so this is qualitative data. And so close-ended questions, they can be self-administered via questionnaire, or, as I indicated, they can be an interview format where a person is reading the questionnaire to another person out loud. Open-ended questions, although they can be in questionnaire format, they usually aren't. They result in qualitative data, and most of the time they're in the form of what we call qualitative interviews. Your book talks specifically about a specific form of survey called time use study. And these are surveys where we collect data on how people spend their time. They play a big role in the sociology of family, because there is a kind of major focus in family studies on how families use their time, their activities, particularly maybe how their days are spent in terms of paid work versus labor at home versus childcare, and the gendered aspect of that. So just know that that's a very specific form of survey. Field work is always qualitative, and it's observations. It's when you go out into the real world, into the community, in order to describe and analyze it or a group. Now, what you do when you go out there can vary. If you are part of the community, if you make yourself part of the group, if you become part of the story, we call that participant observation. If you are just watching from afar, which doesn't mean that people aren't aware of your presence. It doesn't mean that you don't even sometimes occasionally speak to them. But the key thing here is you are not part of the phenomena that you are studying. We call that non-participant observation. The most commonly used methodology is secondary data analysis. I know your book says survey, and that's because Secondary data analysis almost always involves people using someone else's quantitative survey data. So it originates as somebody's large scale quantitative study, and then they make that data available, publicly available, semi-publicly available, and then other people access that data and they answer their questions using that data that was not collected by them personally, but by someone else. It is the most efficient in terms of time and cost, and so this is why sociologists rely upon it so much. Experiments are used much more frequently in psychology than sociology. We don't do a lot of experimentation, but I just wanted to make you aware of that research method. This is where you are testing stimuli by exposing one group to it, but not exposing another group to it. And then comparing the difference between those groups. And so there is usually a clear cause and effect, IV-DV, with the experimental group being exposed to the IV and the control group not being exposed to the IV. Part of why we don't do a lot of experiments is because of concerns around representativeness, concerns around generalizability, concerns around the kind of artificial aspect of creating an experiment. So that's part of why sociologists do not utilize experimentation very often. Even lesser known design in sociology is case study. This is where you do a very involved analysis, observation, interviews with one or a handful of cases. Oftentimes, case studies are most useful when you're studying a pretty unique or rare phenomena. And we do have some of those in sociology, but since a major focus of a lot of sociological research is on phenomena that a large number of people in society experience, we want to do studies that are more generalizable than case study. Which brings me to the last one, unobtrusive data collection. This is where the researcher has no direct contact with any research subjects during the course of the investigation. Usually the research subjects aren't even aware of the research going on. And that's because you systematically gather and examine the cultural artifacts that a population has left behind. And this is why you're able to do it unobtrusively, because you're kind of studying what they've left. And this can be physical objects, this can be still images, it can be sound, it can be video, it can be written text. One specific form of unobtrusive data collection is content analysis. And this is a methodology employed to examine what we call trace communication people have left behind. So this can be song lyrics, this can be Tinder profiles, this can be diaries. And so with content analysis, you look at what's been left behind and then you code your content looking for patterns. But for all unobtrusive data collection, the keyword there is unobtrusive. The person is not aware that you are studying them. And this relates to the final part of the chapter where they talk about the trend to watch big data, because big data, data collections large enough that require special computing resources and complex enough to require customized computer applications. Usually big data is not generated for research purposes, but then we can use it for social science research. That is what makes it unobtrusive, right? This is not data that we went out and collected. Oftentimes they say this involves analyzing large volumes of text from online social interactions, such as social media sites. It can involve studying trends, like what do people click on, what do people buy. It can involve large databases of official records from the government. as Cohen notes, and this is true with all unobtrusive data collection, but it becomes especially true when you're talking about big data, because so many people are being impacted and implicated by it. It raises questions about privacy and research ethics, because for almost all other research designs, people do have to consent to have their behavior examined. They do have to consent that they want to be involved in your research. But with unobtrusive methodology, particularly big data, where you're kind of just gleaning information based on, how people are interacting on these websites. People did not necessarily consent to that. They're not necessarily aware that they're being studied. And so if you have followed any of the news that has come out within, regards to Facebook in particular and privacy concerns, that's what Cohen is alluding to. That we have this ability to have this great data source that can answer some questions that we might have about people's behaviors and people's attitudes. But if they didn't consent, what does that mean from an ethical standpoint? So, that'll be something that, as he notes, might change and might become more regulated over time. So we end with just saying, there are some difficulties in studying family. There's really difficulties whenever you're studying social phenomena. This is part of what makes social science very different than what we sometimes call the hard sciences or the physical sciences. We have to be aware of the context in which the facts occur. There are problems in telling the difference between correlation and causality, because, once again, we're not mixing chemicals in a lab. We're not doing experiments on animals in a lab where we have total control over people and their lives and the factors that are influencing their behavior. So it can be hard to make causal statements. And then there are also just concerns about bias, because we are human beings studying other human beings, other human interactions in institutions. People, even scientists, have to be careful that they aren't imposing their previously held views as they collect and interpret the data. And if you've taken the introductory to research methodology, that bias cannot be implicated completely. All we can kind of do is try to control for it to the best of our ability, acknowledge it, and that there is the difference between what we call, systematic bias versus random error. It's pretty much impossible to control and eliminate random error. It is our goal to, not engage in systematic error, systematic bias. And as your book notes, one thing that helps with this is transparency in the research process, peer review, and publishing your results. And this is why, when I start requiring assignments and I ask you for academic sources, this is what makes academic sources better sources than sources that come from other forms of media, because they have this transparency. They have been peer reviewed, that they had to meet a certain standard in order to be published in academic journals. All right, so that is it for chapter 1. Please reach out to me if you have any questions about any of these concepts or ideas that, even after looking at the video, even after reading, you're still struggling with. I always like to address student concerns early, as opposed to waiting until, you don't do well on a test.